Welcome, everyone. Thank you for joining us for this webinar titled How to Capture Profits in a Carbon Credit Market. My name is Abby Bauer, and I'm an editor for Hoard's Dairyman magazine. It is my pleasure to serve as the moderator for today's discussion. In this webinar, we'll discuss strategies that farmers can employ to capitalize on carbon credit opportunities, hear from dairy producers who are actively executing sustainability programs, and talk about what's on the horizon for the industry. I want to thank Native Microbials for organizing and sponsoring this webinar and our panelists who will be sharing their expertise today. At this time, I would like to introduce to you our panel of speakers. First, we have Jennifer Bocan, who is the co-founder of Conrad Ag Partners, a consulting business that takes a farmer-driven approach to forge collaboration between stakeholders in the supply chain. We also have Austin Allred, an owner of Royal Dairy and Moxie Dairy in Washington State. Austin is a leader in regenerative dairy practices. Brent Robinson is another one of our dairy producer panelists today. He's a nutritionist and owner of Green Point Dairy in Michigan. Brent is working hard to create a farmer-to-farmer network to expand sustainability practices. Sam Schiller is a climate impact entrepreneur and environmental policy advocate who co-founded the company Carbon Yields. And Lisa Mortz is a PhD microbiome scientist at Native Microbials. Lisa is responsible for analyzing the rumen microbiome of dairy cows to understand how the microbial community influences production, efficiency, and sustainability. Each of our panel members has some information to share, and then we will come together as a group to further discuss and answer any questions. If you have anything you would like to ask one or more of our panel members, please type those questions into the questions section of the GoToWebinar control panel, and we will answer those following this initial part of the conversation. We'll start off today with Jennifer, who will discuss some strategies that can be implemented on farms today. Jennifer, please go ahead with your slides.
I'm one half of Concord Agriculture Partners. My business partner, Kevin Gorslick, is the other half. I wanted to take this time to kind of run through some, thoughts on carbon. So first, I just want to validate that it can be very confusing. There's a variety of terms that get thrown around, and especially acronyms that require people to look them up, and it's quick moving and constantly changing. So I just wanted to validate that it's very confusing and it can be quite a bit to stay on top of it all. I'm going to go through a few types of carbon credits, and this will help kind of determine for you the value you can find in each. So there's two types of carbon offset credits. One is an avoided emission credit. This is when you limit or reduce the emissions you're currently making into the environment. Examples of this could be a feed additive. Additional examples could be renewable energy, that gets a little complicated, or capping and flaring your manure, things like this. So you're taking what it typically would be emitted and reducing that. A second type of credit is a removal credit. This in agriculture would be soil carbon sequestration. There aren't many other examples of taking an emission from the atmosphere and pulling it back down in agriculture, aside from regenerative practices. Additionally, you can see an example of removal credits in direct air capture technologies that are being developed by a lot of large tech companies, things like this. A third example is Scope 3 insets. This is where you're going to find the highest value for an avoided credit. So the values of each, I'm just going to quick kind of outline that. So an avoided emission credit is typically lower value. Companies are really interested in removal credits right now because we have currently more CO2 in the atmosphere, or CO2 equivalent in the atmosphere, than the Paris Agreement would really like to see and our climate goals are. So people are very interested in paying high dollar prices, typically in the hundreds, reaching into the 3 digits for emission removal credits, versus avoided emission credits still sit at single digits to into the early teens, getting up to 12, 15 maybe. And that's a typical avoided emission credit. A Scope 3 inset credit is where you can get a higher value for your avoided emissions credit because you're selling it within the value chain. So just to make it clear, a Scope 3 credit would be if the number 1 here is a dairy customer facing company, so they're making a consumer packaged good with dairy in it, you would, as a dairy farmer, would be a part of the Scope 3 of that company. So if you were able to sell a avoided emission credit to that end dairy user of your milk product, you're going to get a higher value than the single double digits for that carbon. The market is still very new, and so there isn't a ton of transparency on pricing, but it's quickly developing, and I'm sure the farmers on the panel later today might be able to speak to some of the prices they're getting. There's some changes in trends. Mostly it's going towards Scope 3, but there's some things you want to be aware of as a dairy farmer in this space. One of these is, contracts. So for any carbon or sustainability practice you're going to get paid for on your farm, you're going to get a contract. And there aren't a lot of lawyers out there that understand carbon. So some terms you might want to be aware of, or just things to look for in a contract. Here's a list of terms to be aware of. Depending on if you want to be able to claim in your milk product or to your cooperative that you've reduced your emissions, you'll want to pay attention to if it's an inset or offset. If you'd like to be able to make these claims to your cooperative or in your milk product, definitely look for the term inset or Scope 3. An offset would be something like the LCFS market, where a lot of folks have digesters that are sold to, the emissions are sold to California, so they can no longer claim those emissions. Which leads me to claim. If you'd like to be able to have the continued carbon rights and claim rights, you want to look for these terms in a contract to make sure that you have the ability to still claim ownership over the carbon after the sale. So if it's in Scope 3, you can still claim it. If it's not, you won't be able to make a claim. So I just wanted to share a visual of insetting because it can be quite confusing. So here I can kind of show you that if an emission was reduced on the farm itself and it's tied to the milk product and sold to an end user of the milk product, that emission reduction can be shared over the entire value chain. Whereas if it's an offset, it is sold to an outside industry and no longer follows the milk product itself. Part of this discussion is also what is easy to implement now. And I just want to say easy is definitely farm dependent. There's a lot of different areas farms are in. There's a lot of different strengths and weaknesses to different farms and locations you're farming in. In addition, different management styles that would determine what is easy for each individual farmer. But in general, a lot of the industry would agree that implementing an enteric emission reduction product into your dairy would be a relatively easy transition if it doesn't have negative production or negative health impacts on your dairy. If there's additional co-benefits to the use of the product, also helpful, but typically this would be seen as a low capital investment and a relatively easy change to make. Other things that are pretty easy to do right now would be participating maybe side-by-side research on your dairy. You could help progress the data and options that we have going on by getting paid to implement a practice to do side-by-side research. Another thing that's pretty easy to do right now would be get a full farm LCA evaluation. There's a bunch of companies out there that do this right now, or different modeling systems that participate in this. So an examples would be Cool Farm Tool, Farm ES, ECO2. They're all going to have different costs associated to them, but they're all relatively easy to do, so you know where you stand and where you could reduce emissions. Brent and Austin, our two dairy farmers on the panels, will be able to speak to how you should prepare for participation or what to be aware of. But from my experience, I would say just save your data and receipts. You might be asked for up to 3 years retroactive data. You'll also likely be asked for receipts if you purchased a product or participated in any sort of cover cropping or other program. So you'll need to be able to provide those receipts. And then my only other advice would be just to talk to people, talk to your cooperative, talk to your end use customers, talk to other dairies in your area, and kind of get a feel for what's out there as an option for carbon. And you'll be able to see what kind of programs may exist, whether it be manure, feed additives. There's different cropping and production options that both farmers will get into. And then there's also efficiency use options that people can get into. And you know, soon an upcoming one might be nitrous oxide emission avoidance. Water is becoming a hotter topic in biodiversity. And I'm sure our panelists have had experience with those as well.
Thank you, Jennifer, for sharing that background information and setting the foundation for our rest of our discussion today. Now we will talk with our dairy farmer panelists, Brent Robinson and Austin Allred. So Brent, if you could bring your video back on, thank you. All right. So now we will talk with these two gentlemen and find out what they are doing on their farms to move toward a more sustainable future in agriculture. Brent, first, could you start us off with giving us a very high level overview of your dairy, including location and current herd size, and then dig a little deeper into practices you're implementing to become more sustainable and to reduce your carbon footprint?
Yeah, I can do that. So like she said, I'm Brent Robinson. I'm one of the owners of Greenpoint Dairy, which is a merger of two existing large dairies, one that I was the sole owner of, and the other was another family that wants to retire. So we kind of have a collaboration where we're working together. We milk around 6,000 cows. We have a site in progress right now, a third site for our young stock. It's part of our long-term sustainability plan is to bring our young stock back from the far reaches of the world. We don't view that as a sustainable long-term plan, and the industry is kind of moving towards that. So we're unwinding that. We're bringing our young stock home. So we have a greenfield site going up right now for that. We crop farm around 8,000 acres, primarily that we own, and we've implemented sustainability practices on those. So that's kind of our high level of what our farm is. And we've been in operation at the dairy that I own. I've owned for 19 years since I graduated from Michigan State, and the other dairy has been in operation for about 25 years.
Very good, thank you. And maybe could you highlight some of the sustainability practices you've put into place? And you mentioned a little bit, but. Okay,
yeah, so if we kind of go through those, the main thing, like I said, bringing the heifers home is one of the things that we're doing. We actually just started we have got a compost barn that we built, probably be one of the larger scale compost barns in the country, for sure for heifers. We've just got the first quarter of that barn in operation in the last 2 weeks as the launch to our Site 3. We have a methane digester at our Marlette location that is not actually produced gas yet, but it's full of manure. So we're hopeful that it's going to produce gas. We're not the owners of that. That's a partnership we chose that we would stay out of that business and focus on the things that we know and let other people do their best. So we're not involved with that. We have with the ownership of it, we just have a manure supply agreement. We implemented sand recycling at our larger location 3 years ago. Sand is a finite resource here. Most of the sand that we're using, or anyone is using, is riverbed sand deposits, and those are depleting pretty quickly since pretty much all the cows in our area are housed on sand. Cover crops on all of our open acres, that aren't in existing alfalfa stands, we're planting cover crops on, and we're planting green and no-till. minimum till where we have to. So I think that covers most everything that we're, and this like challenge or this vision has kind of came about in the last 4 or 5 years that I've switched to going down this path.
Certainly a lot of practices in many different areas on the dairy. So thank you for sharing. Austin, could you tell us a little bit about your dairy and some of the sustainability practices you have put into place?
Sure. So we're here in central Washington, the Columbia Basin, incredible irrigation project. We're sitting right in the middle of it, the Columbia Basin project. Very little rainfall, but a really robust environment to grow a lot of different types of products, which really is beneficial for having ruminants in the middle of that system. So my dad's a potato farmer. I've got brothers that do apples and cherries, and our main focus in the last decade has been to collaborate deeper when it comes to the wood stock, the soil, obviously, and then the ruminants, and how we can close that loop and have a more regenerative system amongst each other. So that's been a lot of our focus, and that's just cover crops and planting those crops that the ruminants are able to turn into protein, and then that goes into all the no-till and some of those conversations. And then more recently, as part of that overall picture and plan, we put in a biofilter. So we have 2 different dairy farms. One of them I'm at now, one of them's a few miles away. And we have biofilter systems to clean all of our water through those. And those are big old worm beds that filter all of our dirty water so that we can recycle that water. And then as a byproduct to that water filtration system, we have worm substrate, worm castings that we are actively working to implement into that regenerative system. So that's been really a big focus for us in the last couple of years. A couple of years previous to that was implementing the water filtration systems. So in the near future, we're building out a soil center to kind of add to our composting practices, our composting facility. So we'll put a biochar reactor, we'll put in an ASP composting system, and then just kind of a feed system for soil health, soil fertilizer coming from all the different resources, the manures, the worms, the worm castings. We get all the wood chips from the apple and cherry trees. So we're working towards that. Probably pretty typical to a lot of dairy farms, but we're trying to focus on localizing our system and feeding plants that we're growing within a few miles instead of bringing in a lot of concentrates from elsewhere.
Sure. I think the water filtration system you have and the worms, that could be a topic for a whole other webinar, and it's a very unique system. But thank you for sharing and explaining some of what you have going on in the dairy. Austin, what value do you feel that some of these sustainable changes have brought to your business, either financially or other benefits that you have realized?
Yeah, so I mean, I think long term, most farmers can agree that being independent or reducing our dependency on like synthetic fertilizers or outside resources is not a good thing. Like that's a good thing. I don't think there's a great argument there that we wouldn't all be happier if we had more independence to continue growing our crops and our products and our produce and our proteins. And that's where the cattle and their symbiotic relationship come with the soil, is to be able to close that loop and have more independence from synthetic fertilizers and others. So I think that's our long-term play is to be able to do that. And I think we all feel good about that on my team, is that we want to do that long term so that we can be around for generations and be sustainable. Some of the short-term victories that we've found is in these carbon credit markets, is to be able to find some partners who are willing to pay for those carbon credits to essentially help us cut out the short-term, massive investment to make some of these things happen. So if you can picture a curve, where's my video camera? I mean, you have to pay all this money, and then eventually over 10 years, we hope to get that back in a regenerative sustainable, reducing our cost system. But that still doesn't work for private farmers. We still got to have cash up front to make that project happen. And that's where the issue comes in. And so that's where, in my mind, these carbon markets have been very valuable in order to help us kind of cut out that curve a little bit more and get that investment back in those carbon credits.
So many of these investments are long-term, but as you said, we need to also be focusing on today and making the business profitable and successful.
That's right.
Brent, when you look at the sustainability changes that you've made on your dairy, what value do you feel like they have brought today and maybe like Austin did into the future?
Yeah, so I share a lot of the same sentiments that Austin, pointed out, which is, the reliance on chemical fertilizers for crop production is not something that farmers feel warm and fuzzy about, So we're always kind of, and those prices, of course, fluctuate directly with crop prices. So I always looked at it like as soon as we started to get into, relatively profitable ranges of our cropping enterprise, company A, B, C, D, E, F, G reaches into our pocket, raises their prices and takes their appropriate portion of our profit margins. And I think every farmer can relate to that and understands that that's what happens. So the, freeing ourselves from that is empowering. And I think that's what Austin was touching on, is if we can disconnect ourselves in a way from the, in the nutrient cycle, which we actually have, most dairy farmers have those amounts of nutrients. If we can preserve them and have them not wind up in the water or in the air, there's power in that. So when we talk about, I approached this transition in our business in a way where I tried to do things that I knew were going to cash flow. Maybe they burned a little bit here and there, but they weren't a big portion of our expenses that we would get hurt with. So because I didn't really rely on outside money to start this process or on carbon credits, and I'm not saying that anyone else is doing it that way either, but that wasn't how I viewed it, because to be honest, the system has moved way too slow. So, a lot of talk going on in corporate ivory towers, but not a lot of money getting down to the action. And so I move way faster than that. There was talks about in the planning of this about, USDA help. Well, USDA moves way too slow for me. Like, I don't have enough years for that. So we just tried to do things that made sense. So I looked at it in a way that I said, okay, if we have 150 fields and those 150 fields that we're operating at this year, next year are better by the things that we've done, I can't exactly put a hard value on that, but I know that it's real. So if we wake up, in 2030 and I'm sitting on 8,000 powerful, healthy acres compared to 8,000 dead acres with no biology and no nutrients that are bioavailable, there's a massive difference in our bottom line. And that's the long-term sustainability that Austin was talking about, is if we can build that power into our system, you can't put a value on it. That the risk aversion, the bioresilience, let's call it, the ability of my farm to survive through a drought compared to, if I hadn't done this and all of those kind of things. I don't think you can put a number on it. And the reality is I'm getting that benefit. It's coming, it's slow, it's not real, it's not a hard number. But if you put it on your balance sheet, I had spoke earlier when we talked about I bought 1,000 acres or 1,100 acres from a guy that was completely biologically dead. And I had told a person when we pulled into one field, I said, here's a shovel, I'll give you $1 million if you can find a worm. Because I knew he would never find a worm on the farm because there was no risk of it. There's no sign of life in the field. So when I talk to farmers, I say, if you go in your fields and nothing lives there, you really need to consider what you're doing, because you've killed everything. Like, you have killed them. The sun didn't kill them, the rain didn't kill them, you killed them. So we're bringing worms back to life in our system in a way that I couldn't even imagine how quickly it's happened. And all of those things are just signs. You don't get a check for them, but it's a sign that our system is improving. You know, we've had years where we left corn stalks in the fields and nothing ate them because there was nothing there to eat them. Well, now they eat them. So that is kind of how we've chosen to look at it, and we're starting to now get some benefits of being able to sell some credits and do some things. But I chose to try to look at it as do things I knew were smart to do that would almost cash flow or nearly cash flow, and just start in on the risk and just go for it.
There are so many aspects of the dairy business that we try to measure with numbers and values, but you mentioned many great examples of things that can't necessarily be measured, or a number can't be put on them. As you implement some of these environmentally friendly strategies, sometimes they go against our general practice of how we've done things for a long time. A few things that pop into my mind, or maybe cover crops and planting green, are things that haven't been done by a lot of farms for a while. And sometimes you face maybe some perception from other farmers or challenges if there are programs, Brent, like you mentioned, that are moving slow or are difficult maybe to participate in or understand. Brent, what are some of the challenges you feel like you've faced as you're trying to make your farms more environmentally sustainable? And tied in with that, is there any advice you would offer other farmers as they're trying to get started down this path?
So, one of the things that I went into planting cover crops really heavy in 2018, and 2019 showed up as one of the wettest springs on record. We were planting corn like almost 2 months after we had it originally intended. And we had some fields that we looked at, on a, Wednesday morning, and it's going to rain tomorrow and it's too wet to work it. And we said, well, we're going to plant green this year, I guess. And we just started planting green. And what we learned from that, kind of being forced over the ledge, let's just say, you're standing on the edge, we're going to do this, we get shoved in. We had some challenges in the front end of not being able, because of the weather, being able to control the cover crops soon enough. But at the end of the year, when I compared my crops to my neighbor's crops, I wound up with more grain. I wound up with a better corn crop than my neighbor who had worked the soil, whose crop looked better than mine on June 15th. But on September 15th, I had more grain. So, and we learned things about, checking the temperature on the soil and learning about, soil overheating and killing the biology. And I learned a lot of things that summer by being just forced into it. But what I would tell people is, there's a lot of things that you can do that you can see easy, simple benefits from. There's a lot of labor savings, there's a lot of fuel savings, there's a lot of things, especially on the cropping side of things, that you can do that all you have to do is just change how you think. And it's a little bit like our compost barn that we're putting in right now. Everyone goes there and looks at the compost barn and the bedding is brown. Well, we're all used to seeing the bedding be yellow. We want our calves standing in knee-deep straw, and we're going and we're looking at brown compost, but our calves aren't dirty, they're fine, but it's in our eyes, we're used to seeing yellow, deep bedded straw. That's when we're happy. That's when we think that looks good. In the crop side of things, it's a lot the same. The farmers aren't happy unless they see a crystal, like a flat, clear field of brown dirt that they just worked at. If they haven't killed all the biology yet, they still get to smell the dirt. I mean, they're in the process of not even smelling dirt anymore. But long term, they're going to work their way through that, and the seagulls aren't going to come anymore because there won't be anything to eat. But that's what the farmers are used to. So if you start to change how you look at it and get a feeling of that being different, and I think my children are going to look at it different, because I go to the fields and I'm excited to see the size of the radishes and the turnips and the sunflowers, and I make them take their picture with the cover crop, where the generation before us was excited about the size of the tractor and the field cultivator. So I'm hoping that that's going to change, but there is easy stuff that farmers can start to change and see real benefits quickly if they just change how they're doing things.
Great points. Austin, any particular challenges you faced or advice you would offer to other dairy producers?
In most cases, going off of what Brent said, a lot of these practices make sense for a number of reasons. I would say there's next to nothing I've done simply because I was solely trying to reduce my carbon footprint. Not to say that I want to reduce my carbon footprint, but everything I've done has a lot of benefits outside of just that. Like that's just one of those benefits that I'm receiving for some of these practices. But beyond that, I think the advice that I would have is there is a lot of people, a lot of partnerships, a lot of uh, and very intelligent people who are really excited about this. And so finding those people and working with those companies to be able to understand all this a little bit better and to see how you can capture some of the financial benefits from it also uh, is something that I've really been surprised with. I mean, the partnerships of people who want to talk to me because of some of the risks that I might be taking, like Brent's talking about, has been really, really fun. And the relationships I've developed with these people who are just really excited to understand what I'm doing and try to help me do it has been a fun piece that I wasn't expecting. So I guess just opening your doors to the different companies within your supply chain, within your inset supply chain, but then just others who can help you along the path has been really cool.
Yeah, absolutely. You both talked about some current projects you have going on, and I think some things that might be coming down the pipeline on your dairies in the future. Austin, what gets you most excited about the future of your dairy in terms of being sustainable, or maybe just the dairy industry on a whole? You know, why do you think it's important that we focus on sustainability?
I get really excited about just closing the loop and where we started, just not being dependent on other fertilizers, other people, other companies who do not have my best interest in mind and who certainly don't have the generations to come's best interest in mind. So that is what gets me really excited, is to find ways, find nutrients in that nutrient cycle that I can capture and close that loop. And that all ties into that same big conversation of capturing your carbon and keeping it active within your ecosystem. So that's what gets me most excited, and I love doing it. And it costs money sometimes. It's risky. I fail a lot. A lot of times, like Brent's mentioned, it's very anecdotal. There's not a lot of science to make you feel all warm and fuzzy about it all the time, but the results are real, and you can see how that starts to pay off in your farm. So that's what gets me most excited. And so to dive a little deeper is working with the cows, the worms, and the soil to really have that to create a better symbiotic relationship between those, because I really believe that's God's intent for this creation, is to have all these different species working together. And as I kind of uncover this and manipulate this so that in my system, which is a very scaled system, we're creating a lot of food for a lot of people, and figuring that out on a commercial level to make sure the cows are being utilized to their fullest extent when it comes to soil health. Same with the worms and the worm farms that we have. So that's what gets me fired up, and I think what kind of gives me the drive to keep getting my ass kicked sometimes when I make bad decisions.
The cows, the worms, and the soil, such an important trio in agriculture. So,
Yeah.
Brent, any projects that get you really excited about a sustainable future on your dairy, or just kind of final comments in general?
One of the things that I wanted to bring up that Jennifer had reminded me of from when we had talked a long time ago is, like, I really had an epiphany around sustainability when I took a trip to Alaska, and I was on a bus doing the Denali National Forest tour, and we're sitting there looking up this mountain, and there's a couple grizzly bears up there, and the lady on the bus says, there's approximately this many grizzly bears in this forest, you know, and the lady in front of me on the bus, she says, how could they know how many grizzly bears there are? And that was really the epiphany to me, because if you understand how they know how many there are, they know how many grizzly bears can be supported on that land. So only so many grizzly bears can live in that forest, because only so many rabbits can live there, and only so many coyotes, because it will only support that. So if you think about sustainability in that way of in its rawest form, where it's still untouched by humans and diesel fuel, the sustainability of those ecosystems is, you know, X number of bears can live here in this, and it's real. It's real. So for us, we can't fathom that because, you know, more people can move here tomorrow and somebody conjures up some food for them, shoves that into the grocery store, they pick that up and give them a little more diesel fuel, turn the power up, make another power plant, everything's fine. Reality is it's not fine. So that's what I guess keeps me motivated when you talk about that, is that I have kind of a big vision of, you know, what sustainability really is, and we are so far from it that, I mean, we can all do methane digesters and whatever we want. We're so far from sustainability, we've got major problems. So I look at it as this path of evolution to the next step, which what got us here is, you know, the green revolution in the 60s and fertilizer and genetics. And I know that, you know, maybe these companies that we talk about that are supplying us all, I don't think that they've done us a bad job. I think that they are innovating with seeds, and they are innovating with fertilizers, and they are doing those things that need to be done for today's method of system, and they're trying to create value, and they're trying to provide value for, and all the people that work there are trying to do their best. The reality is we keep doubling down on a broken system. So over time, we're not going to be able, you know, the fear would be that we're not going to be able to out innovate. And then we have to go back to biology, natural systems, and try to figure it out. The issue is it's going to take us years to do this. So that's why I really focus on it, and that's what keeps me motivated with it, is just what really sustainability means. You know, there's a lot of questions about what does it mean? What it means is, can this system function without outside inputs? And the reality is Austin's farm can't yet, mine certainly can't, our competitors can't. We cannot function without outside inputs. We have to bring in, you know, inputs from outside to keep our productivity up. Currently, it's going to be a long walk. And so to me, I get excited about that because I have already done the, hey, let's get big, you know, let's just milk more cows. Let's see if we can do it. I mean, I know I can do that. If we want to do that, we can build the farms, we can milk the cows, you know, but my ego is not driven by that anymore. And mine is more driven by, you know, can I do something that, you know, is really hard to do? I mean, and I feel like we can do it. So that's what I'm working on.
Thank you, Brent and Austin. It's really interesting to hear what you have going on each of your dairies. At this time, if you want to turn your cameras off for a few minutes, we will shift to Sam, and he will discuss where the industry is headed. So welcome back, Sam.
Thanks so much for having me. Great to be here.
Absolutely. So for right away, what are the kinds of carbon footprint assessments and measurement technologies that processors are rolling out? Can you maybe talk a little bit about some of those programs that are available?
Yeah, absolutely. And just off the bat, I just want to say how inspired I am to hear about Austin and Brent's great work. And, you know, we want to make sure that any of these tools that measure the impact and hopefully get folks paid for that kind of impact, that they feel additive, that they're not a drain on the project, that they don't claim all the resources that should be showing up to reward these practices. And I think that's been a challenge as these technologies have matured, that you could spend all the carbon revenue you might earn on soil samples or on monitoring. And so, you know, Carbon Yield, my company, really tries to represent producers in these conversations and find the right balance of monitoring technologies and you know, financial impact to get the right balance of uncertainty and kind of reward for producers. So I think there are some kind of three different categories of tools you might use. You could do direct measurement tools like soil sampling or like a gas monitor, which might be appropriate for a digester or you know, other kinds of methane interventions. You know, but those direct measurement technologies are expensive and you know, sometimes don't actually give you better answers if you don't have a truly comprehensive, you know, sampling plan of all your acres, well stratified. You know, it's hard to just do it all based on direct measurement. And so there are models that you can deploy that take into account the kind of management practices you've implemented, the kind of weather conditions you might be exposed to, might even be able to be calibrated by some samples or some other kind of direct measurements on site. It might give you some sense of where you're scoring in terms of sustainability. And then there are also kind of coarse emissions factor tools, tools like Cool Farm tool that, or LCA tools, as Jenny mentioned, that just say, hey, generally, not even taking into account those complicated weather factors, if you implement this kind of practice, we would expect you on average to get these kind of results. And those are more kind of decision support tools that you might use to figure out, like, hey, is this actually gonna, if the goal is really around greenhouse gases, is this kind of practice actually going to score well? I guess the piece that we're kind of excited about that's coming down the pike is a real revolution around remote sensing tools, the kind of tools that can use satellites to look at what's happening on the ground, looking at photosynthesis and looking at the crop cover across a landscape. That might give you some clues about both the managed practices that were implemented and how well they were implemented and what kind of outcomes might come from them. So we do a lot of work with a tool called Habitaire. There's others, Regrow, that use some of these remote sensing tools that might limit the kind of burden for a producer to fill out a massive survey of every single variable, the 400 variables that might impact greenhouse gases. And so we think it's going to get easier, but also acknowledge there's some practices that are really hard to detect from above. It's hard to know what your fertilization and kind of nutrient management plans in detail are just by looking at imagery of aerial imagery of your property. And so we try and balance getting the information that is meaningful, that is related to the interventions you're making on the ground, data that's most significant in a greenhouse gas calculation, and the stuff that's not available from automated tools that are out there. So that's the way we try and balance the kind of benefits you get from a greenhouse gas calculation with the cost in terms of implementing those systems.
Yes, so much of this is a balance between the financial side and the environmental side. What are you seeing out there in terms of incentives for some of these carbon programs? And are there penalties, or do you see any penalties coming down the road for farms that don't participate?
Yeah, I mean, I think that there isn't a lot of appetite to penalize producers. I think it's a lot more carrots than sticks at this point. There may be down the line some international penalties around trade policy. So there may be tariffs on higher carbon commodities if you're trading with Europe, that they have really strong environmental regulations there. And they say, hey, if folks are importing commodities that have a higher greenhouse gas footprint, eventually we might impose they call it a border adjustment mechanism. It's a little down the line, and it only affects certain commodities that would be trading into those markets. But there aren't real greenhouse gas regulations coming for agriculture. And I say that from conversations with USDA and others, that it's just not a lot of appetite to regulate individual producers. It's more about hey, how do we create the incentives and support systems so that we can make a transition? I think at a bare minimum level, there are some conservation cost share kind of resources like EQIP and like conservation stewardship program and the kinds of tools that NRCS or conservation districts deploy that might offset some of the upfront costs of buying cover crop seed or potentially even buying a piece of equipment. And with the recent IRA, Inflation Reduction Act, those programs got a whole lot more funding. Usually those programs serve about a third of the applications that come in, and the goal is to have those programs, really support anyone that submits an application that's, eligible for these supports. We'll see how that happens, but those supports are designed to be compatible with a carbon program. It's not that, hey, you take those supports and you're no longer eligible. It's meant to be kind of a subsidy to get folks going. So we really recommend forming the relationships with those kind of local bureaus and RCS offices. And sometimes it's a labyrinth of paperwork, and we work through some of that paperwork in partnership with folks on the ground. But that can be really, it's free resources. You're not necessarily paying it back, and it can just help you get going. Jenny mentioned a few of the other kind of incentive schemes around a carbon offset project. There are both compliance markets, like regulated markets, like in California for carbon offset credits, where you could get a credit for a manure digester system. So that's one kind of incentive you might get. There are voluntary carbon markets, which don't necessarily sell to folks that are required to reduce their emissions, but can sell to any company that has a voluntary goal, and doesn't necessarily have to be someone in your supply chain. You can sell to an aviation company or to a tech company. There's a lot more flexibility about the kind of interventions that are eligible. So, cover cropping strategies and cropline strategies would work. Feed additives that reduce enteric fermentation are qualify. Rotational grazing practices that potentially induce a soil organic carbon response. Those are eligible in those markets. But there can be long-term commitments of, maybe making a change for 100 years, or committing to those reductions, past your kind of operational timeline. So it really depends on the intervention, but I think we're seeing more producers get interested in these insetting opportunities. The idea that you're sharing an emissions reduction with a brand in your supply chain, with a co-op that's representing a product. Could even be potentially someone that's transporting your goods. I mean, everyone, not everyone, but many of the dominant corporations that have big climate footprints have made big goals to reduce those impacts. And a lot of those impacts, start in the farm gate. Food brands, I think it's 3/4 of their emissions are on the farm. So there's a real opportunity to potentially share those emissions reductions across the supply chain and get compensated for those changes, and potentially to get financing to make those changes on the ground, or to do longer term contracts, or to have a higher price early on to cover the implementation costs, and maybe a brand gets longer term certainty from there. There's a lot of ways to make sure that you're kind of aligning the incentives in those scope 3 programs.
You're right. We're all in this together. All areas of the food production chain are going to be feeling more and more pressure from outside forces to really focus and kind of clean up our industry in different ways. So thank you for that. What are some of the best things that farmers can do now and in the future to prepare themselves for some of these incentive structures that are built around these carbon programs and overall sustainability goals?
Yeah, some of it is around just tracking what you're doing in practices, and keep a log of when you're making changes. The data is really king here, and some of it is tracking it in real time, but some of it might be taking photos, saving receipts of what you're, the equipment you're buying or seeds you're buying. All these things are helpful for substantiating that, like, hey, something really did happen here. So getting your arms around your data, certainly forming partnerships across the supply chain. I think that there's a real interest. It was interesting. Austin was saying, like, hey, a lot of this is about being independent and circular on the farm, which is totally true. But then it's also looking at the other partners in your supply chain who can co-invest with you. It's hard for one farm to represent themselves in a carbon market or an insetting project. A brand's just going to have a lot more demand than the kind of output one farm can generate. And so figuring out how to aggregate and have more bargaining power in a bigger group can be really helpful. I guess the other piece is really finding out where your goals overlap with greenhouse gas reductions. Figuring out what your vision is on the ground to make sure that your farm can survive into the next generation and thrive. Like, what are the ways that you can reduce your nutrient budgets while also meeting those greenhouse gas goals. Maybe improving longevity in cattle health. I mean, it could be a whole set of things that are goals internally, just as an operation, that also overlap with these greenhouse gas goals. And being prepared when someone says, "Hey, we have some money to invest in our supply chain. What do you want to do?" Like having that list of, hey, these are the top 5 things that achieve our internal goals and also have an impact on greenhouse gases.
Last but not least, we will hear from Lisa. First, I want to remind everyone that if you have any questions for our presenters, we will have a few minutes at the end of the webcast to answer a couple of questions. So feel free to type those in to the questions section on the control panel. Lisa, can you please talk to us a little bit about what native microbials has done to help better understand the role the rumen microbiome plays in cow productivity, nutrition, and sustainability?
Yeah, so as we've heard, one big aspect of dairy sustainability is reducing enteric methane emissions. And that's really interesting from a microbiology perspective because it turns out a dairy cow doesn't actually produce methane on her own. It's the microorganisms that are living in her rumen that produce enteric methane. So understanding some microbiology is absolutely essential for tackling the issue of enteric methane emissions. And as you referred to it, the collection of microorganisms in the rumen is referred to as the rumen microbiome. So over the past decade, our knowledge has exploded, both in identifying the microorganisms that are native to the rumen and also in learning how those native organisms correlate with dairy cow physiology. So it turns out there's tens of thousands of unique microbial species that have been identified in the rumen using DNA sequencing techniques. And from a genetics perspective, a simple count shows that there's actually more than 1,000 times as many unique genes coming from the rumen microbes than there are from the cow. So a lot of a dairy cow's genetic potential lies within her rumen microbiome. And in fact, if you were trying to predict how much milk a cow produces or how feed efficient she is, or even how much methane she's belching, her rumen microbial genes would do a better job at predicting those values than her own genetics. And that's not entirely surprising, because we've known for over a century that the microorganisms in the rumen are responsible for breaking down feeds that monogastrics like ourselves can't digest and turning that into energy that the cow can use. So it's really that they have a specialized symbiosis where ruminants provide this nice, warm, anaerobic environment that makes a lot of specialized microbial biochemistries possible. And the microbes in return provide the cow with energy from a food source that most other animals can't access. But at the bottom of this specialized symbiosis between a cow and her rumen microbiome is inevitably methane production. So methane is produced by a group of organisms called archaea, specifically a group referred to as methanogens. And they take hydrogen, which is a byproduct of bacterial fermentation and especially of fiber degradation, and reduce carbon dioxide into methane. So these methanogens are part of the core rumen microbiome, meaning that they're in all cattle, regardless of breed or location or diet. And so they're really an important part of ruminant metabolism. But there's also cliques of microbial species that compete for hydrogen and carbon dioxide with the methanogens. And we know that harnessing the carbon that's burped out as methane instead into something really valuable for the cow, like fatty acids, would be much more efficient. So kind of like what Austin was saying with the carbon going into the air, you want to keep as much of it you can in your loop. And so to really highlight that burping out methane is a loss of carbon that the cow might otherwise use, studies have shown that feed efficiency and methane production are negatively correlated. So more feed efficient animals tend to burp out less methane. So what would be ideal is if we could shift the rumen microbiome to favor a community state that's making less methane and is overall more efficient. But doing the research required to meet this goal is really challenging. And one of the reasons is that it's actually super hard to measure enteric methane, especially on a commercial dairy, like Sam was discussing. There's many variables influencing it. And so right now, the gold standard for enteric methane emissions is respiration chambers. This is like where the cows are confined in an airtight bubble. But a Holstein in a bubble behaves differently than a Holstein in a freestall barn. And there's also restrictions on how long a cow can remain in a respiration chamber. So it makes it difficult to look at longer term changes in enteric methane emissions. So one thing that I'm working on at Native Microbials is testing some cheaper, easier ways to measure enteric methane emissions that could be scaled to the commercial dairy. And since methane is produced by the rumen microbiome, we're seeing if we can accurately estimate enteric methane emissions by looking at changes in a dairy cow's microbial community. And actually this past spring, we were awarded funding from the USDA to explore this option on commercial farms starting in 2024. So these on-farm trials will measure enteric methane emissions in cows fed with and without Galaxis Frontier, which is one of our microbial products that's already demonstrating a beneficial impact on milk production and feed efficiency. So stay tuned to hear more about that, or please feel free to reach out if you're interested in participating. But ultimately, directly reducing enteric methane emissions is only one piece of the puzzle in trying to improve dairy sustainability. And especially when we're thinking about things that add cost to a dairy, like feed additives, there has to be a financial benefit to the farmer in order for that product to be used long term. And the carbon credit markets are helping sustain some of these technologies right now, but long term we're going to need products that provide additional value beyond just enteric methane reductions. So one example is that studies have shown that enteric methane emissions increase over the lifetime of a dairy cow. So she's making more methane and peaks in her second or third lactation, but the average commercial dairy cow only reaches 2.5 to 3.3 lactation, so we're losing her most efficient years. So we could directly reduce methane emissions by improving dairy cow health and longevity and efficiency, and at the same time that would also contribute to reducing total emissions by raising fewer replacement heifers. So there's still a lot to learn, but I think it's a really exciting time to be caught up in the momentum, the sustainability movement. And I think ultimately this momentum will help reveal a lot of undiscovered mechanisms underlying the symbiosis of a dairy cow and her rumen microbiome.
Yes, the rumen is such an amazing machine. So congratulations to you for receiving that funding, and good luck as you dig deeper and do some studies in this important area.
Thank you.
At this time, I'll ask all of our panelists to rejoin by turning on their videos. And we do have some questions that came in. So I am going to go over here and I'll ask just a few questions here as we near the end of our time together. First question here will be for Brent and then Austin. Are you receiving carbon credits for using feed additives that reduce enteric methane?
So yeah, we actually are. We have a contract for those credits. It doesn't offset the cost currently, so it's a net cost to the farm for the feed product compared to the value that we're receiving. But we are selling credits from that, but it's nominal, the value.
Same, we are. I will say it's getting more valuable as the years go on. So this year we should be able to double our value that we got from last year to this year. So it'll slowly start to cover almost all of the cost.
Sam, are there multiple programs available to U.S. dairy producers in this area?
Yeah, but most of the programs that are available are, available across the U.S. Some of the inset opportunities can be supply shed specific. So if you're working with the brand and they know where they're sourcing, they want some traceability. But the programs with Vera and Gold Standard and Climate Action Reserve, all the voluntary programs are available across the U.S. and even California's program around digesters allows for out-of-state dairies to participate. Some details about how much of the supply they want from in-state and what the value of those credits are, but yeah, there's a bevy of programs available in the U.S. for dairies.
This question is for Jennifer. It's a little detailed, so I'm just going to read it here to you. In the diagram on Insetting, it showed that the emission reductions are shared among all participants, the farm, the CPG, and so forth. Can you explain how multiple entities can claim the reductions associated with an inset while avoiding double counting?
Yeah, so it is clear. Transparency is essentially the answer. So you need to be very transparent. There needs to be clear contracts and there needs to be clear traceability. So essentially, as long as you can trace the milk product and guarantee it's moving hands between certain players, then you can guarantee that claim associated with the milk can be shared as long as it's traced along to the milk. This is also a very detailed area where Sam is involved with the technology in the MRV. So I'm sure he could dive into how that actually could be traced with data. So if you want
Yeah, sure. I think the big detail that we pay attention to is, are two folks at the same tier of the supply chain trying to claim reductions associated with the same unit of milk, you know? So you couldn't have two retailers that are saying, hey, this farm did something back in our supply chain and we're both claiming those same reductions. You know, you could have, you know, Target and FedEx and, you know, the producer potentially share that claim if it's the same unit that's traced through the system. So it's you know, and sometimes brands don't want to share those claims just because it creates some liability that folks might question whether there's double counting. And so there's questions of like, what can you do and like what might you want to do? I think, again, a lot of this gets contracted, you know, that you want to be clear about who owns those assets, who shares them. You certainly also don't want to have the same reduction claimed in an inset as in a carbon credit that's, you know, sold in a compliance or voluntary market. You know, Microsoft and and Target can't claim reductions from the same activities. So
a lot of the solution for that comes from serialization. So you can't have this, you serialize this individual carbon reduction unit and then ensure it's not being used as an inset and an offset, because that's often where double counting becomes an issue.
All right, our last question, anybody can jump in if they feel like they have something to contribute. How do you find companies to work with? How can dairies find companies to work with to earn those carbon credits and be a part of this, kind of be a part of this new wave that we're experiencing in the dairy industry?
I'll start.
Go ahead.
Oh, sorry, Sam. The checkoff has DMI and the state checkoff have been very helpful for me, and I can't say it's free because it's not, but they've been very helpful without any additional cost. So I've leaned on the checkoff a lot, and they've really gone to work to help me build these relationships, and now I have direct relationships where I sell thousands and thousands of carbon credits directly to these different brands that are inset or scope 3 of my dairy.
And yeah, depending on the project, you know, there can be project developers involved that will take on that marketing side of things and find buyers for credits. I think that the inset opportunities are inherently kind of tied to your supply chain, and so certainly tying it into the kind of procurement conversations you might be having either at a co-op level, or if you're big enough for them to have kind of your own downstream relationships for your marketing milk. Like, understand that this is another commodity that you're producing on the farm. It's not just the milk; it's the environmental impact that you're creating. And so, yeah, each of those procurement conversations now can have another asset to negotiate around.
And as Concord Agriculture Partners, that's often our goal, is a farmer first way of operating. So we're happy to help farmers connect to whoever they are selling their milk to and finish that supply chain connection. Keep it less at arm's length and more of a direct communication, so you can really get the maximum value for your claims.
Yeah, and I'll just step in here really quickly. I mean, that's kind of how I got involved with this in a bigger way, is with Kevin, Jennifer's counterpart, and now Jennifer later involved. But I would say to make sure that, you know, you don't go to people and talk about what you might want to do. I mean, the farmers really need to start the process on their own and get moving. And then once you have a story that you have something to, you know, something to talk about, it's a lot easier to, you know, to approach these people. So don't go to them and say, what can you do for me? Why don't you go to them and say, what can I do for you? Because if a lot of these things, the farmer is gonna be the person who has to do it anyway. So if you start that process, then it goes a lot easier. And so I have a co-owner of another small company that we have, and we try to tie farmers together, you know, like, and with Jennifer, we'll work with them as well. But they, you know, we start with the people who are already in the process. We're not in the business of trying to convince farmers, to do things, the right way, the new right way. The farmers need to do that themselves to get started, and then find people to help, and those people will be there. I'm really convinced now that the people are going to be there. The long-term mindedness of all the parties is going to be important. So when you're looking to find partners to work with, this is a long-term deal. So the farmers better not, I'll only plant cover crops if they pay me. Okay, next farmer. That's if I was a brand, I would say, bring me the next guy, because that guy, he's out. I don't need him. I need a guy who's committed, or a gal that's committed to doing this, and then we'll go from there. So.
Okay, at this time, I'd like to thank our panelists, Jennifer, Brent, Austin, Sam, and Lisa, for sharing their insight and experiences with us. I really enjoyed the conversation that we had today, and I hope that our audience members found it beneficial. I'd also like to thank all of our listeners for taking the time to be a part of this webinar. We really appreciate you taking time out of your schedules to be with us. This webinar was organized and sponsored by Native Microbials, and if you'd like to contact them or learn more about their products or services, you can visit them online at nativemicrobials.com or reach out by email. Their email address is dairy@nativemicrobials.com. A recording of this broadcast will be available online, and all participants will receive an email when that presentation is ready. So if it's something you'd like to view again or share with anyone else, you will have access to it in the near future. From all of our production team members here at Hoard's Dairyman, we'd like to thank you once again for tuning into today's program. We hope you found it to be interesting and beneficial. So take care, everyone.